Okay, guys. Well, thank you so much for coming to my presentation. We've lost the chair. That's okay. I can chair myself. My name's Dr. Josie Vine. I'm from RMIT University. I teach into the journalism program there. I want to start by acknowledging the people of the Woiwurrung and Birnbauer language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across this great nation of ours, and wherever you may be. My research interest is in the evolution of journalism-specific values and beliefs. So those unwritten rules that aren't actually articulated anywhere, but are so strong with each and every journalist, and it's kind of what binds this bizarre group of people together as journalists. And one of the most fascinating of these that I found is that of source confidentiality, and I'll talk about why that's so fascinating in a moment. So let's just to define source confidentiality. It's when a source imparts information to a journalist and the journalist then imparts that information onto the public, but the source is only comfortable with the imparting of that information if he or she remains anonymous. So when you think about it, when you're in the business of, as journalists are, of getting information from one source and imparting it onto the public, if you take away that one source, they're out of business. So it's no wonder that source confidentiality, establishing that trust, is absolutely sacrosanct to journalists. But the rest of society doesn't necessarily agree. There's no legislation that protects journalists from not revealing a confidential source. A judge is quite within his or her right to charge a journalist with contempt and can send them to jail for up to 2 years. So it's pretty serious stuff if you're using an anonymous source. Now, no judge has gone that far, i.e. sentencing a journalist for 2 years into jail, but they also have no qualms about threatening it. Now, if you look at this quote from Judge Michael Rosines when he fined Michael Harvey and Jared McManus after they pled guilty to refusing to disclose the source of a leaked story about a federal government proposal to slash war veterans' benefits, we can see what the judicial kind of general attitude is towards source confidentiality. He said journalists are not above the law and may not, without penalty, expect to be permitted to follow the personal collegiate standards where those standards conflict with the law of the land. So what Judge Rosines' comments highlight really here is this discrepancy, this kind of inherent discrepancy in expectations between the four critical democratic institutions of our country. So the executive and legislative arms of government, the judiciary, and journalism. And somewhere in this space that's been caused by this discrepancy, the public benefit is somehow forgotten. What I find fascinating about the value of source confidentiality is how there is no overt, articulated rule about how to deal with confidential sources. Now, as a journalism educator, that's really, really difficult to teach young, up-and-coming professionals that part of their job might be to break the law and end up in jail for 2 years. The closest we get is the MEAA's Code of Ethics, which says, where confidence are accepted, respect them in all circumstances. However, this still doesn't tell journalists that if you get hauled up in front of a judge and if you get threatened with jail, you still have to maintain that confidentiality. Also, of course, the MEAA's preamble says that basic values, i.e. source confidentiality, often need interpretation and sometimes come into conflict. So this then means that theoretically there is wriggle room with source confidentiality, but that's not how journalists see it at all. If it's not a written rule anywhere, then this value must be cultural, because it must come from somewhere. It is so strong. So it must be coming from the traditions of Australian journalism. So my interest is in how naming confidential sources has evolved to become journalism's most culturally revered taboos. Now, like all cultural values and beliefs, those specific to journalism are handed down from generation to generation through cultural narratives. So my interest was to investigate how this professional commitment to source confidentiality has been passed down, has evolved throughout the years. So I examined journalism-specific cultural narratives. In other words, those products, those cultural products that journalists read or consume over time. So that includes things like biography, autobiography, the communication products of the MEAA, formerly the AJA, Walkley Awards, etc. Now, the earliest mention of refusing to name a confidential source that I found was when the editor of Table Talk, a precursor to Punch magazine, his name was Maurice Brodsky, was demanded to name his source in the Victorian Parliament's inquiry into the theft of its ceremonial mace. Mr. Brodsky had written that the mace was stolen by, and I quote, a party of merry ladies during an evening of, quote, low travesties of parliamentary procedure, and could even now be found in the nearby brothel. Although the threat to fine Brodsky for contempt was only that, a threat, it was significant because it can be seen as the founding case of Australian journalism's cultural commitment to confidential sources. Now, this was in 1881, and Mr. Brodsky may have escaped punishment because prior to the outbreak of World War II, it was accepted convention inherited from England's King's Bench court to give journalists legal indemnity against naming sources. But it appears somewhere along the line, the judiciary in Australia underwent a change of heart, possibly part of the increased restrictions put on journalism on the eve of war. Now, the precedent, from what I can gather, was set in 1939 when Truth editor Frank McGuinness wrote a series of articles revealing that certain persons were collecting money from the Milk Board to bribe members of Parliament. In the preceding Royal Commission, he was called as a witness to instructed to reveal his source, which quite obviously he didn't do. The Victorian Supreme Court fined him £15 for an offence against the Evidence Act of 1928 for refusing to answer questions without a lawful excuse. Now, McGuinness appealed to the High Court in February 1940, but this was unanimously dismissed in April of that year, which actually set a precedent that was to last for the next 80 years and, in fact, continues to do so. The McGuinness decision instigated a collective action against the legal requirement for journalists to name sources. The Australian Journalism Union, now the MEAA, but then the AJA, began lobbying for indemnity legislation in 1940. The issue, from what I can make out, was a matter of timing. The majority of the association felt that with war looming, the inevitability of restricting journalistic activity even more was very, very real, and there would be no political appetite for increasing its legal protection. The association decided to take no further action at that stage. However, this is significant because the collectivity of the union now meant that refusing to name a source in a court of law was recognised as a truly embedded cultural commitment, omnipresent among all journalists. This was articulated 4 years later when the long-anticipated Code of Ethics was established in 1944. Clause 3 of the 8-Point Code obliged journalists to respect all confidences received by him in the course of the calling. So we can see that the code was an important step towards articulating this microcultural commitment to source confidentiality, but it still had no legal standing, still has no legal standing to protect journalistic activity in a court of law. So source protection as a cultural value continued its construction, and there was a flashpoint event when in 1953 police raided Sydney Morning Herald offices. They were looking for paperwork revealing the identities of 2 unnamed Sydney City Council aldermen who were demanding a royal commission into corruption within the council, and the Sydney Morning Herald had been reporting on this. In fact, all Sydney papers had been reporting on this. And the reportage was demanding a royal commission. In response to the publicity, the state government refused to hold a royal commission and instead gagged the council by rushing through the Sydney City Council Disclosure of Allegations Bill. That afternoon, after it had been rushed through, police visited editor Douglas Pringle's office, asking him to name the paper's informants. And I love this story. The story goes that Douglas Pringle was given leave to consult Managing Director Rupert Henderson, who, during the conversation, phoned his friend, who was the truth editor, the famous Ezra Norton, for advice. When he hung up the phone, Henderson said back to Pringle, "Ezra says it's simple. All we have to do is decide who goes to prison." In other words, there was no question of acquiescing to police demands for the names of anonymous sources. The next day, the offices of Fairfax General Manager Angus McLaughlin were also raided, and he was ordered to disclose the names of the anonymous aldermen. McLaughlin not only refused, but he also declared he was going to start sleeping on a bare bench at home as a way of getting used to jail conditions. In other words, revealing the names of the anonymous sources never even entered his head. So this cultural commitment continued its evolution. 1989 was another flashpoint. Perth Sunday Times reporter Tony Barrass, and there he is there, became the first journalist in Australia to go to prison for refusing to reveal a source for a story in which he used a tax leak to highlight poor security in Perth's taxation offices. Later, Barrass was called as a witness in a preliminary hearing after a tax office clerk was charged with leaking the documents. Barrass refused to say who gave him the documents when asked, and he was jailed for 7 days for contempt of court. What I like about this example is the ensuing outrage within the journalism community stamps this case as an important cultural narrative. The West Australian newspaper published an editorial the next day saying the principle of a free press had been dealt a savage blow and called for a review of the law to include privileges for journalists. A meeting of Sunday Times AJA members called on Barrass to be released and the law changed. The federal executive meeting of the AJA sent a statement to the WA Attorney General condemning the court's actions. And in Perth, a meeting of 250 journalists heard statements read out by the branch secretary from journalists in country towns, state branches, federal executive, and the International Federation of Journalists. Excuse me, that's my 5-year-old son who's just run through there. Ignore him. Although the Attorney-General agreed to meet the AJA to discuss amendments to the law, it was still, at the time of writing, contemptuous for a journalist to protect a source when asked to disclose his or her name in a court of law. In July 1993, Sydney Morning Herald journalist Deborah Cornwall refused to give the New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption the name of a police officer she had quoted anonymously. The Commission pursued the matter to the Supreme Court, where Cornwall was given a 2-month suspended sentence, including 90 hours of community service. The same year, Christopher Nichols of the ABC was given a 4-month jail sentence, the longest ever handed down in Australia for protecting a source. Nichols, and I find this really interesting, he was also charged with impersonation, false pretences and forgery as a result of his investigations. According to the prosecution, Nichols had impersonated someone over the phone to gather the information, which is a pretty serious charge. Nichols denied making the calls, but refused to reveal the identity of the person who did. And this is what I find really weird. The jury acquitted Nichols of the more damning charges of impersonation and false pretences, but it was for refusing to name his source that he shared a maximum security cell, mind, not just any little pissy jail, a maximum security cell with a murderer for a reduced sentence of 12 weeks. Now, in 2011, we thought, something's going to change. The Evidence Amendment Journalist Privilege Act was put through. This meant that judges have the discretion to weigh up public interest and adverse effects when demanding a journalist to name a source. However, this still means it's up to each individual judge's perception of public interest and adverse effects, which would be fine if judges actually understood and sympathised with the public benefit and the democratic function that journalists perform. So let's just have a little listen if I can. I've just got a little clip here of Nick McKenzie being interviewed by the wonderful Bill Birnbauer, and I have to acknowledge here Bill Birnbauer's projects, Democracy's Watchdogs. I'm sure you've all seen it, but if you haven't, please have a look. It's a magnificent resource. And this is just a little bit of Nick McKenzie and how journalists are viewed by the judiciary in modern times. Remembering that Nick McKenzie is possibly Australia's highest honoured journalist.
Well, so a magistrate, a judicial officer did ask and basically threaten us through the powers of the court to come in to be called up to the stand and reveal a source, confidential source. We knew we weren't going to do that. We pushed them forward. I remember the morning that we were due in court, and I had a pretty bad night's sleep, and that was partly because my lawyer sent me a message at about 11 o'clock at night saying, if you're called up tomorrow, you're going to refuse to answer your sources on the stand. This is unlikely to happen. There's a chance you might be remanded in custody. If that's the case, it's best that you're not wearing Nikes into court, because the prisoners like Nikes. Wear a crappy pair of shoes so you can keep your head down. So it made it a real life event. You realise the stakes are high. But that said, that's a pretty simple choice. You don't use force. In this case, we pushed back. And we fought with lawyers. And various appeals, we won the day and didn't have to have that choice to say on the stand. That said, I've been in coercive hearings where I've been in that situation. Said who my sources are, and I've been warned you'll be charged, and you say, well, give me your best. And luckily in this.
Okay, yeah, not a very clean cut, but I did my best. I think the point about Nick McKenzie is he is actually a cultural icon within the journalism profession. As I said, he's the most awarded, highest respected journalist in Australia at the moment. and is certainly a cultural leader. I know my students certainly look up to him. And as you could hear from that, there's no way he would reveal the name of a source in a court of law. What astounds me, well, not astounds me, but kind of fascinates me in a scholarly sense, is the way that the most honoured, the most respected, the most senior journalists in this country are also the ones who are most punished. Now, this discrepancy cannot be good for democracy. So what's the way forward? Well, there's not a lot of point in changing legislation, giving judges that leeway, if judges don't actually recognise what public benefit and what journalists do. I guess the only way forward really is to put a change through the Constitution. Now, I know in 1944, Curtin put forward a journalistic freedom bill for referendum in his 14-point reconstruction plan after World War II, and it was voted down by 54%. So I don't know if changing or trying to change the Constitution is a way forward either. So in the meantime, we're relying on the cultural commitment of Australian journalists to source confidentiality. It is very difficult for me to teach that. I could lose my job if I'm teaching students that they have to break the law. So I guess the only way is to continue this narrative that's been handed down from generation to generation within Australian journalism. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Josie, and I'm sorry I was absent at the beginning. I had an old version of the program and I didn't realise I was actually chairing this session, so sorry I wasn't here for the beginning.
Absolutely fine. I did the welcome to country and I introduced myself. I did okay.
You did it DIY. Thank you very much. Thanks for such a interesting set of stories and kind of case studies of that ethical tension and then the legal frameworks. So really wonderful paper. Thank you so much. I just wondered if there's any questions. I think we have a few minutes. Questions or comments for Josie? I think a couple of people, and I had struggled to hear it, couldn't actually hear the audio terribly clearly. It wasn't coming through that clearly for us at the other end in Zoom. I think it was getting a bit scrambled by Zoom. So would you just like to recap what Nick McKenzie was actually saying in the interview?
I thought that might happen. He was saying that he's been in coercive hearings before where he's been threatened with jail for not revealing his source, and he was saying that he never ever would do that. And at one point his lawyer asked him to go to court, don't wear Nikes because you might go straight to prison, and the prisoners like Nikes and they'll get taken off you, was his anecdote. So for journalists, this is a very real threat.
Yep.
And they just do it. They just take it on when really they should be out there, reporting on stories that benefits us all.
Thank you. Thanks for the summary. That was great. So any questions from the audience? I had a question around how you see, I guess the cultural role of journalists is ever more important, and that role that you're, the sort of labour, the skills that journalists have about investigative reporting and assessing verifiability of sources while maintaining confidentiality. I guess that's kind of a key role of journalists, and in the whole, diversification of news outlets and the pressure on news. But I was wondering how you see institutions like, WikiLeaks or organisations which are not strictly speaking news reporting but claim to be doing journalism, and the way that they might be able to operate, successfully or unsuccessfully around some of those legal restrictions.
The way I see journalism, and a lot of people have tried to define what journalism is, and they're all right in one way or another. But I see journalism as not necessarily the actual practice of journalism, but the ideology that's going on behind that practice. So a commitment to public benefit, a commitment to sources, a commitment to accuracy, a commitment to truth. And if you haven't got those commitments, a commitment to independence, and if you don't have those commitments, then by your very definition, you're not a journalist. Now, you might be, I don't know, reporting on the CWA lemon butter competition, and that's fine. You're still a journalist if you hold those commitments and those kind of, it's what goes on here and what goes on here that makes you a journalist. All the rest you can learn. So WikiLeaks, I believe, has that commitment. And remembering that they don't really write for the public, they write for other journalists, or they publish for other journalists. But other organisations or individuals who claim to be journalists just aren't. They might say they're journalists, but if they don't have that cultural commitment, you know, accuracy, fairness, balance, etc., if they don't have that commitment, then they're just not. That they don't fit the definition. So that's the way I see it. You're either committed to it and you're a journalist, or you're not. And the other thing that drives me mad is there's people who think, like I saw that guy on Media Watch the other day who was reporting on the protests and it really just winding it up. And the protesters were welcoming him to report on them because he was, you know, he's quite right wing and blah, blah, blah. But you can tell that he's a guy who just thinks journalism's this thing that you can, or this toy that you can pick up and play with. But you can't, because you have to have that cultural commitment. Whether the public sees it that way or not, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking specifically around getting around some of the questions about sourcing, the way that, you know, and I think journalists use this, like peer-to-peer networks and secret Dropboxes and things like that for sources to ensure confidentiality. Yeah. Cool.
Oh, absolutely. And there was a lovely webinar by the Melbourne Press Club several months ago, and they were saying, don't use digital media anymore. If you want to protect your sources, don't use digital media. Don't carry your phone around because they can track you and they will trace you. Just go off with a pen and paper. That's all you need. And that's how you protect a source. So we're going back to the old shorthand days.
And Judy, did you have a question?
Oh, thanks. Yes, I did actually. I'm interested in the role of the union in this, that since we've had contracts coming in and there's been a lower level of unionisation, how do we keep that commitment to these values going without the union being as strong as it was?
Absolutely. And the funny thing about the journalism union is it is a union, but it's also a professional association, and it tries to fulfill both functions, and that's tricky. From my perspective, it is more of a professional association than a union, and by joining the MEAA, you are openly declaring your commitment, and I think even with the casualisation of the workforce, I think everybody, and I'm not, you know, pro-union or anything like that. I'm completely objective. I'm a journalist, but you know, I think and I tell my students, it's really important to be members of the MEAA because it says something about your professional practice. It doesn't say anything about, you know, whether you're unionist or not, really. It says something about your professional practice and your commitment to it. I think the union has a very, very important role as a professional association as opposed to a union.
Thanks.
think we've run out of time. I think it's time. I think the conference close is about to happen. But I just wanted to thank Josie so much for such a wonderful presentation. And last thing I want to ask, is that going to be published? Are you publishing that story?
I hope so.
Great.
I will try.
I'd love to read it and sit down and read through all the examples.
I just want to put in a little plug. All of these details are in my book called Larrikins, Rebels, Larrikins and Journalistic Freedom in Australia by Palgrave.
Great.
Please buy it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
See ya.
Bye.